I don't know why you want to be a doctor. I don't know if you are sure why you want to be a doctor. And that, for me, is enough to not want to invite you for an interview. Application Renovation Season 4, Episode 5. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Big fan of the show.
Yeah, no problem. I wish I wouldn't have to have anyone on the show. I wish everyone got into medical school. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And thank you for coming on and being vulnerable enough and open enough to share a little bit of your application, or a lot of bit of your application, with hopefully the hope of finding out where things can improve for next application cycle if you need that. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Thanks.
So let's talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of the application cycle for you. How many application cycles have you been through? How many interviews have you been on? What does that look like?
Right. So this is my first time applying. So I'm in my 4th year of my undergrad.
Okay.
I only got 2 interviews. I got put on one wait list in a school in the US. Funnily enough, I am a Canadian applicant, so I wasn't really expecting that.
Okay. So 2 interviews. The other interview was a Canadian interview?
Yeah, it was my local university, but they'll let me know the results in March.
Okay. So you got a little time to find that out. And then you said you were waitlisted at the US school. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was Wayne University in Detroit.
Okay, yeah, Wayne State. So, what did the interview process look like for you? Were there any things that you were concerned about coming out of it? Did you not prepare well for it? What did that look like and feel like for you?
I definitely prepared a lot. I know, like, my school had practice MMIs every weekend, and I went to all of them.
Okay.
I felt pretty good about almost all my answers. Except for one, which I think might have kind of really not done me well, at least for the US one.
Yeah.
They asked me, why do I want to study in the US? And it kind of like threw me back. And I was like, oh, the weather, I don't know. It was not very good. But I think, like, later on in the question, I sort of answered it better. I don't know. I wish I could just redo that one question.
Yeah.
So it could just surprise me.
Was the Wayne State an MMI or no?
It was. It was actually pretty interesting. So it was, I think it was really long. It was 3 hours.
Okay.
So I think there was 5 MMI like modules,
Stations.
I guess.
Yeah.
And then a talk with a professor and another talk with a student,
Okay.
a medical student. And they asked me more personal questions.
Okay.
Right.
So it's kind of a hybrid, a little one-on-one,
Yeah.
a little MMI. Awesome. Okay. All right. Got it. In terms of the application itself, I'm assuming you've seen some application renovation or know a little bit about it. Where do you think you have some shortcomings in terms of kind of stats or activities or anything like that?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I applied, in the summer. So after finishing my 3rd year, so maybe I'm disadvantaged that way. We're competing with, people that have graduated, people that are doing their masters. I think another disadvantage is that I am a Canadian student, but I feel like that doesn't answer why I did even more poorly in the Canadian applications.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I came to ask for some assistance, right?
Okay, sounds good. All right, so let's take a look at your application and let's see what we can see. So we'll jump over there. The first thing I always like to highlight is when you actually submitted, and it was about a month after the application was open for submission. So I think this 2021, 2022 application cycle, you could submit, I believe, May 27th. So you submitted June 28th. Not horrible. I like to say, like, submit in June, you'll be fine, and you can just see the delay in submission and verification or processing was all the way into mid to late August. So not the end of the world. Certainly not the thing probably that is keeping you from getting more traction here in the U.S. But so something to potentially improve upon next time. It's just applying a little bit earlier. We get to a disadvantaged essay, and we have an interesting disadvantaged essay. It starts off a little gruesome. What was the goal of kind of going a little bit maybe too far into the details?
I don't know. Like, my parents told me not to go that deep into it, but I just didn't want to seem like an average immigrant. I guess I feel like that's not disadvantaged enough.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to talk about that stuff in general.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And actually, like, in one of my interview questions, they actually said, like, yeah, like, this story is like, and like, it's insane. Like, this, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that was the right choice or not.
It was the choice you made. And so potentially pulling back a little bit, because it's both hard, I'm assuming, for you to talk about, for you to think about, and it's hard for people to read. Right? For a person to go, oh, like, somebody had to live through this. Like, we understand conceptually that there's a lot of bad stuff out in the world, but when we have to read it, when we watch it on TV, like, it doesn't feel good. And so ideally, we're not making our reviewers kind of like want to like move away from your application. Like, oh, I don't want to think about that. So maybe a little bit too far in the details at the beginning, and then talking about kind of what you went through, normal kind of culture shock, which is expected, and the things that you did to adjust to that, which is great. So I think at the end of the day, you had this story here of being an immigrant, going through that struggle of being an immigrant, learning new culture, new language, new everything, and just what you went through. So I think at the end of the day, it did its job. I talk about the disadvantaged essay as being a context essay. It gives me, the reviewer, context about who you are. And so I think you did the job, other than a little bit of like, ooh, like, I don't want to think about that. The other thing, and I'll just point it out once, and it was an interesting use of the language, and I don't know if it's more of a Colombian thing. I don't think it's a Canadian thing, but the use of the word learnt versus learned.
Oh.
It's almost very uncommon to use learnt versus learned. And so I don't know if someone reading this would go like, oh, that's just a typo, or, oh, that's just weird. It was just a weird thing that you have it a lot in your application, and it's just awkward every time I read it. The smallest thing, but I just thought I'd point it out. And so I was Googling it. I'm like, do Canadians use learnt and we use learned? Like, you guys add extra U's because of British English to color and whatever. And it seemed like learned is Canadian and U.S. American. Anyway, I thought I'd point that out. But we move on to getting to red flag area. No big red flags in your application, which is great. And we get to transcripts. We see lots of A's, some B's, and lots of current and future courses. It seems like a very short transcript. And I'm like, well, how many credits is this? It doesn't seem like a ton, because we get very quickly into the bottom here. But I guess it's normal. 30 hours for freshman year, 30 hours for sophomore year, 27. So it just seemed pretty short. I don't know why that is.
That's actually something I was worried about initially, because I took like a special course, like a special 1-year course in first year that was it was like, it only shows up as one class in my transcript, but I think it's 9
It's
credit
9 hours.
each.
Yeah, we see it here. Integrated
So,
Science 1 in lab. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a
So,
big one. That's fine. Those kind of random classes like that, lots of universities, lots of schools have those kind of weird, unique courses. When I was an undergrad, I took an accelerated bioorganic chemistry. So it was biochem and organic chemistry merged together. And I was worried, like, how are schools going to look at this? Are they going to see that I met the requirements? Whatever. It's not an issue for the most part. Okay, just scanning through looked a little bit short. But you had mentioned that was one of your concerns of you're competing against people who have already graduated, competing against people in post-bac or masters. Like the common route is still doing what you did. The traditional finish 3 years of school, apply to medical school, finish your 4th year, and then start medical school soon thereafter. So that it in of itself is not a disadvantage. Where some disadvantage may come is because you're applying after your junior year, or kind of in between there, right? In between the semesters, you may not have enough time to get the experiences and other things that you may need to tell your story in the best possible way. So that is a potential issue, especially as a Canadian applicant, where Canadian applicants typically have a bigger issue getting shadowing and clinical experiences. So we'll talk about those here in a second. So we get to GPA, 3.8, science GPA, 3.83, cumulative GPA, so solid GPA, right? GPA is not your issue. We get to your MCAT score, 513. It's a great MCAT score. 128 in Chem Phys, 128 Cars, 127, and then 130. So not a huge issue. Canadian schools just kind of anecdotally seem like they care about the MCAT a lot more than GPA. And so maybe for Canadian schools, that was a bigger issue for you. I know there's 1 or 2 schools that like only care about the Cars section, but it's not a across the board Canadian thing. So maybe for Canadian schools, the 513 isn't enough. For U.S. schools, it's a great score. All right, and then we get into research and your activities section. And so you have your honors research course here, 400 hours over the course of the year. The one thing that I highlighted here was the thing that you put at the very bottom, which is basically this statement: I haven't really done anything for this yet, but I'm telling you what I have done. And this is a very common thing that students do when they're trying to force something into their application that's going to happen, but they haven't done it yet. If you don't have anything impactful to say because you haven't done anything yet, I probably wouldn't have put it in, because then it just looks like fluff and a filler. Right? I have begun to read the related literature, attend lab meetings, and booked an appointment to receive patient ethics course this summer. So AMCAS does not give you the ability to put future activities on. TMDSAS does, AMCAS does not. They expect your start date has happened, you're doing it, you can write about it, you can talk about it. If you can't do that, then I probably just leave it off the application. Same thing here for your next one, President of Integrated Science Mentorship Program. It looks like, based on the last line, I was voted to become the president this year, and I'm excited to continue to provide with new resources. So, are you the president, or are you becoming the president?
So I'm the president now. I was voted last April.
Last April. When did you become the president?
So I guess then, but I mean, I wouldn't be doing anything until the school year started.
Which was?
I did September.
September.
Right? So,
yeah. So again, and that's what I assumed was very similar to the first activity here was I haven't done it, but I'm going to do it. And that's the same thing here. Your experience name is, hey, I'm the president of this club, but you're not the president of the club yet. You have nothing really to talk about being the president of the club. What I would have much rather have seen was you are a member of the club or whatever your role is in the club, and then as the experience name, talk about the club, the experience, your impact, and then mention that you were elected president in the description without calling the description name the president. Because when I see the description name of president, I'm going to be looking at that activity description through the lens of, oh, you're the president. Show me the impact that you've had as a president. We get to some meal assistance volunteering at Veterans Memorial Hospital. You have it listed here as medical clinical, feeding geriatric patients. So I think it's okay overall. Nothing huge. You have a little bit of some storytelling here. You have a little bit of talking about John here in the most meaningful part. It was okay, right? Nothing terrible, nothing bad. You missed a period here at the bottom. Again, nothing major. Just it was okay. Good job there, I guess. So we have a most meaningful medical clinical. Again, for U.S. medical schools, for U.S. experiences, feeding probably isn't the best clinical experience. But again, from a Canadian aspect and understanding the limitations that you all have, maybe a medical school here is like, okay, that's fine, right? You're close to the patient. That's about as good as you're going to get. We get to the model patient for ultrasound workshops. You labeled this as medical clinical. I would not have labeled this medical clinical, right? Because you're just a body that they're poking and prodding with ultrasounds, right? So I probably wouldn't have labeled that medical clinical. Not the end of the world that you did. As a reviewer, I would have just like marked off those hours. I'm like, oh, those aren't medical clinical hours. But interesting. We have science book club. Some interesting stuff there. We have paid employment, not medical clinical. Working at an ice cream and bakery store. Again, a little bit of a typo. Looks like you're missing I at the beginning. I have been working. Unless it's more resume type writing of just have been working. And then the description itself here is a lot about the customer, right? My favorite customer was this retired lady, and she did this, and she did that, and she did this. And it was less about you and your impact, right? Remember, this is your application. And sometimes this happens when students take my kind of storytelling a little bit too far, and it's all focused on that person and not enough reflection about who you are. We have Let's Talk Science. And so here we have an interesting thing where you talked about what you did, but I'm missing any impact. What's the reflection? What's the takeaway? What did this mean to you in the description? So just missing there. And that's an important part because it's not just what you did, but how and why it's affecting you and why it's so important to put it on your application.
Well, that's one that I was debating leaving out. I just felt like I didn't have that many hours in it. Although I did a couple things, like I just didn't really like it that much. So I kind of, stopped doing it.
Yeah. And so that statement right there of like, oh, I didn't really like it, so I just stopped doing it, is probably a clue to leave it out. Because what happens during an interview where they're like, oh, let's talk about this. Let's talk science. You're like, oh, shoot. Like, I don't want to talk about that. It was a year and a half and only 25 hours. So it seems pretty obvious that it wasn't that enthralling to you because you didn't do it that much. Research. So you have some research here. Just some basic information about the research. Nothing special there. You have campus chairperson for global brigades. It's always hard for me to say that one. And this one, again, you have marked as medical clinical, but it doesn't seem like it's medical clinical. It seems like you're just, You're kind of a spokesperson for global brigades. You're organizing stuff for global brigades on your campus. Medical clinical is interacting with patients, right? Doing things with patients. So global brigades can be medical clinical when you are actually doing a brigade, right? When you're in another country or wherever interacting with patients. But from your description, it doesn't sound like that's what you were doing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just thought it would, like, they'd understand that.
Understand
I'm
what?
not sure. I think I wrote specifically the amount of shadowing hours. Maybe it was in a different thing.
Yeah, you have here 12 hours of e-shadowing.
Yeah. So should I separate them apart, or should I?
Well, shadowing wouldn't be listed as clinical either. Shadowing has its own category for AMCAS of shadowing. So, yeah. So again, it just looks a little bit weird, and this is the second time now in your application. You had the one where you're the model for ultrasounds. You have this one where you're listing as medical clinical, and now I'm starting to wonder, like, what's going on here? So we have that. We have scholarships and awards. It's great. Model United Nation. No issues there. Camp counselor. No big issues. It's really interesting, though, that this seems to be the bulk of your time, right? 1,500 hours from 2016 to 2019. And so I look at this and I go, if you had that much time to do that, why potentially weren't you trying to get or do other things, right? Does Canada have an equivalent of some sort of medical assistant for undergrads where you're not shadowing, it's not volunteer around patients, but you're getting paid to help out with patients? Is that something that Canadian applicants can be doing? And so it's a lot of time for not medical clinical. Looks like it was fun.
Yeah, I think the big thing with that was that it was in high school. It was a lot of volunteer work just over the summer and, like, March break and, like, Christmas break, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
oh, my cat's yelling.
That's okay. But that wasn't. It wasn't all high school,
I don't know.
Right? Because it went through
May
2019.
The first year. Yeah.
We have hobbies. So here's another most meaningful. Gardening as a most meaningful for a hobby. I think it's perfectly fine to have hobbies as a most meaningful. And you just talked about your gardening hobby, which is great. No issues there. We have another hobby here, exercising, yoga, and running. Great. Again, I like having hobbies on an application. And then we have painting, selling stickers, creating medical diagrams as artistic endeavors. And that you can see huge timeline from 2005 to 2022. So you've been an artist. Again, most meaningful, I think, is perfectly fine. So looking back at the application, you've had the three most meaningfuls. One was a medical clinical experience, feeding the residents at the veterans home. And then two others were one hobby, one artistic endeavor. Some people may question, like, well, why do you have so much non-medical stuff as most meaningful? I don't have a big issue with it. I think you need to tell your story, and if that's what's most meaningful to you, then go for it. And we get to your personal statement. Okay, so looking back on activities. For U.S. schools, lack of shadowing is huge.
Right. Yeah.
Potentially. Right. As a Canadian applicant, we understand, hopefully, that shadowing is an issue. We are in a time now with COVID where you can do virtual shadowing and put it on your application. And you even talked about virtual shadowing in your Global Brigades activity description. So I would 1,000% try to get as much virtual shadowing as possible through any of the different outlets that are doing virtual shadowing, including my e-shadowing, and putting that on your application as a shadowing activity. And then clinical experience. Again, from a U.S. standpoint, clinical experience interacting with patients, being a scribe, being an EMT, a phlebotomist, a medical assistant, a CNA, like being around patients as much as possible. And the one kind of true medical experience that you have is feeding patients, which some may go, like, okay, I guess maybe we'll count that. But the ultrasound model and the global brigades one would be discounted. Like, that's not clinical.
Right.
So potential big lack of shadowing and potential lack of clinical experience, which for my philosophy on how all of this works is if you don't have those things, how can you be sure you want to be a doctor? Right? It's interesting because in the US, that's how we do things, right? You get clinical experience, you get shadowing, you go through undergrad. In Canada, it's similar but different because there's some restrictions around what students can do. But in all the other parts of the world, right, students go straight from high school to medical school. Like, well, did they get enough experience to understand that this is what they want? But there's a big difference in terms of they're not committing hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to medical school, to go into debt and have that over their head for the rest of their life. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but it's interesting. All right, we get to any questions about activities?
No, I think those are good points. I kind of had a feeling that I didn't have the clinical experience for U.S. schools, especially.
Yeah.
Do you think they would look down upon just shadowing experience, or how much that would matter? Like, would it be worth looking for some sort of clinical experience job?
I think you should.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's vital, both for getting into school, but for the first reason and why it helps you getting into school is so that you understand better what you're doing, why you're doing it.
Right.
So that's why I'm interested to look at your personal statement now, because typically I find students who lack clinical experience, lack shadowing, have a harder time writing a cohesive personal statement that tells the reader why they want to be a doctor.
Yeah.
Okay. And to me, that is always where the stickiness comes from. So we get to the first paragraph here, and it's kind of this story of you being an ultrasound model. I'm assuming you led with this because you thought it was an interesting hook.
I did. I also, like you mentioned, I assumed they would be like, okay, he doesn't know why he wants to be a doctor. Like, he's not a nurse. He hasn't worked in the healthcare field. But I guess showing that, I've known about the healthcare field, I have like some understanding since I was young, might make up for that. I'm not sure. That makes sense.
Yeah. Why were you a 10-year-old being poked and prodded for candy?
Right. For my parents, I guess. My dad. Yeah.
What was your dad?
He's an anesthesiologist.
Ha ha ha. Okay. Nowhere in your application, personal statement, do I see that your dad is an anesthesiologist.
Oh. Yeah.
Why was that left out? That seems like it was purposefully left out because you had to like try really hard to just say, oh, it was candy compensated ultrasound pediatric vascular access model for a medical workshop that my dad was running or whatever, right? Yeah. It seemed like you purposefully left that out.
I don't know. I guess everything you hear online and even from your show is like, don't lean in or talk about how your parents are in the healthcare field too much. I thought it was like,
but you see that qualifier at the end that you added. Too much. Yeah. Right? You don't want to make it seem like you want to be a doctor just because daddy's a doctor.
Right.
But to give context to who you are so that I understand why a 10-year-old is going through this. right? 10-year-olds don't just like find a flyer on campus and go, oh, this sounds cool. Oh, I get a lollipop for this? Sweet, right? That doesn't happen. So obviously I read that and I'm like, there's something weird here. What do the parents do that are putting a child in this situation? And there it is, right? There's the context. Dad is an anesthesiologist who's either at or running a workshop, right? And I'm in this situation. I have been around healthcare for as long as I can remember because my dad is a physician.
Right. Yeah.
That context gives so much more than just, oh, I was a 10-year-old getting poked and prodded for candy. Okay?
Yeah.
So for all of you watching, listening, if your parents are physicians, if they're PAs, if they're dentists, if they're physical therapists, whatever, in healthcare, mention it. Don't make it the heart of your essays, but you need to mention it because it gives context. Okay? So we have this hook at the beginning. I wrote a comment here like, what's the goal of this, right? Because you have it here. It wouldn't be until later that my experiences as a patient and interactions with patients built my fascination for patient care and medicine. So I would challenge that statement because your dad was a doctor. You're obviously in this situation. You had some sort of fascination around it from an early age. And so you avoiding talking about your dad being an anesthesiologist forced you to kind of lie a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I think it's something I could have written better. And it's, I didn't really want to like do this journey until like my second year of university. I majored in psychology. I wanted to do clinical psychology. And then, first day I got sick, like in this story, and I started volunteering at that place. And I started doing more research and I felt like, medicine is a path I wanted to go down. And also I really didn't like psychology, but boring.
So let's continue the story and see if it makes sense to what you're saying. So we get to the second paragraph. You talk about medicine and art, right? So medicine through art. You were studying figure painting. You're learning small anatomical details, capturing whatever. It was fascinating to see the growing connections between my art and medicine. So that comment, right? Art and medicine. Why was medicine even in your head?
I don't know. I never seen art as a job. I've never studied art at a university level.
Yep.
Although I do like to paint in my free time. I even did diagrams for some professors, but I don't consider myself professional. Sort.
Yeah, I never said you were professional, that you were considering being professional. I asked, why was medicine in your head? The goal of the personal statement is show me this journey that you've been on to become a physician, right? The prompt. Why do you want to be a doctor, basically? And so you have this connection that you're making between art and medicine. And I don't know why medicine was there to be able to make that connection.
Right.
I don't know that as a reader, right? I'm talking to you so I can get a little bit more context. But as a reader, I'm like, well, not every artist is thinking drawing, going, oh, wow, this is fascinating. I wonder what the innervation of that muscle is. Let me go be a doctor to learn that.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So weird connection. Again, I think parts of your story are missing because you were avoiding some things and just it doesn't make sense so far. So, and then you have some research here. While working in a lab studying brain consciousness or concussions in rats, I saw the applications of pathology and pharmacology through the visible changes in their brains and behaviors. So a very fancy way of saying
I like science.
I like science, right? That's a very fancy way of saying, ooh, science is really interesting to me. Okay. And again, why are we here? How did you get there? How did you get into a lab studying concussions in rats from art, from being poked and prodded as a 10-year-old, from apparently being a psychology major? So lots of just, I don't understand at this point, which is very common when students lack clinical experience. They don't have a really big foundation to be able to tell this story. So those are the assumptions that I'm making as I'm looking at your personal statement. So then you got the flu. Okay. You lost 10 pounds, ended up in the emergency room, almost died, right? A little maybe hyperbolic-y, right? Flu kills a lot of people every year. What's interesting here is how you told this story and tried to connect it to being cared for. Is the nurse pulled up a chair next to you. Yeah. And that's what helped you knowing that you were being taken care of, right? Obviously, we love nurses. We couldn't do our job without nurses. No knock on nurses, but this is a why do you want to be a doctor essay.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so basically what you're saying, if I were to paraphrase, is I want to be a doctor because the nurse took care of me.
Yeah.
See the disconnect there? And that was the kind of the follow-up, right? Having someone treat you with compassion can improve the healing process. Very generic statement, not really talking about you wanting to be a physician, just this like, oh, compassion can help, which, yeah, we have studies that show like being positive and taking care of someone and making sure that they're cared for and they're loved and all that stuff, like that helps. And there's still no connection to why you want to be a doctor. Okay? So I'm 3/4 of the way through your essay and I'm still confused. Who are you? Why are you doing this? You're a 10-year-old looking for a sugar high, getting poked and prodded with an ultrasound machine. And that apparently was enough, maybe? Although you said at the end of that paragraph that it wasn't until later that things came. So I'm still waiting for those things to come. And then we get to volunteering at the hospital, feeding the Veterans Geriatric Care Unit. And you have this callback. I was often reminded of the times of feeding my own grandfather after his stroke. So now I'm like, oh, well, maybe there's a story there that for some reason we're not being told, as maybe an initial interest in taking care of someone, like in some sort of healthcare related way, seeing how he was treated after having a stroke, maybe seeing recovery after stroke, something around there. How old were you when your grandfather had a stroke?
It was not too long ago. I think it was 2016.
How old were you?
I was 17.
Okay. So still early on, not necessarily pre-med at that point.
Right.
So still kind of foundational to an experience. And did your grandfather live with you during that time? Does he live close to you to be able to take care of him and see him often?
He lives in Colombia, so it's pretty very far away. So I only get to see him a couple times a year.
Okay.
Or a couple times, once every 2 years.
Okay. Do you think that there's any experience there where his stroke impacted you in some way?
Like, it definitely impacted me, but I don't think I could write an essay about medical school about it. Do you know what I mean? I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I'm not looking for a whole essay, but maybe a little anecdote. But tell your truth, right? If no, not really, then that's fine. That's your answer. We get into a little bit of a story here with Bill, right? Meeting Bill, one of the patients, brought him lunch. It was disheartening. He didn't respond. Seems a little like I don't know, self-centered isn't the right word, right? Like, respond to me. Like, that's not cool. So I don't know, that word choice there was just a little bit weird. That's disheartening. So talking their ear off during the meal, setting this context of like, they're not really communicating because of what they're going through. So I'm just going to talk, right? What's the harm? So that shows some good things about you. Right? So that's good. Talking about taxis and this story, right? This is probably the best part of your personal statement because I get to see a little bit of you here, your interaction with this patient, and I'm left with still like, what's next? How did this impact you? Why is this important enough to be in your application to be telling me this story? So, and you left it with, it's a shame you're leaving. I hope to see you soon. Right? So it's like, oh, I should be a doctor because the patients want me there. I'm like, well, like, is that the right reflection that you want? Seems a bit weird. So you continue on. You feel sad when you leave the unit. And just your small little conclusion here, right? I hope to continue to make my impact, as small as it may be, on the people around me, to one day be the physician that I would want to care for me. Okay? So that's really the first time, I think, in your essay where you're talking about being a physician and what that potentially is. So we get to the end of your personal statement, and my fears have come true, that your personal statement isn't going to be able to tell me why you want to be a doctor. Potentially, number one, because you avoided talking about your dad being a doctor, but potentially because of those the lack of experiences that you've had, the lack of reflections about how you got here and being able to tell that story. Again, that's just how I focus on writing a personal statement. So I get to the end here. I don't know why you want to be a doctor. I don't know if you are sure why you want to be a doctor. And that, for me, is enough to not want to invite you for an interview. Because I am scared that you're going to get here and you're going to go, oh, this is not what I expected it to be. Okay? And that is enough to scare people away. We get to a school list, and you have a very, very, very small school list. Talk about the schools that you chose to apply to and why you only chose to apply to, 7 here?
Yeah, and actually I only got to send in the secondaries on 6 of those 7.
Okay.
So the reason why it was so small, well, firstly, I went and looked at the schools that treat Canadian students as out of state.
Okay. Versus international.
Yep. And then I looked at their requirements.
Why would you be scared about being treated as an international student, assuming they still accept international students?
I just thought it would be harder to get in.
Probably a miscalculation, because if a school says we accept international students, right, it's still a small number of seats in general.
Right.
And even if a school says, oh, we treat Canadians as out of state, they may still keep you in a separate bucket as out of state Canadians. So I wouldn't have tried to play that game. I would just go, who accepts international students? And then, who treats Canadians a little bit differently in terms of out of state versus international. But that would have opened up some more schools for you that potentially would have been a good fit. And with your stats, it wouldn't have been a huge issue to overcome.
Okay.
So that's the school list. Any issues you think with letters of recommendations?
Nope, don't think so.
Okay. And then we look at, I want to take a look at secondary, something I've been doing a little bit more here in season 4, because I think secondaries are very telling as well. I had a conversation once, the Dean of Admissions at NYU, Dr. Rafael Rivera, when I was writing my personal statement book. I was like, hey, Rafael, can you give me a quote for my book about personal statements, how you use them, whatever, about the importance of personal statements? He's like, honestly, we don't like personal statements. That too many students write about random things, and we call it a village statement because they're getting input from everyone on what to put in and how to write it. So he's like, we focus much more on secondaries here at NYU. And so I want to look at your secondary here. And one of the questions you have here is, what characteristics and qualities are necessary for successful leadership? Do you think all physicians should be leaders? Please discuss your reasons. The biggest thing for me with secondaries is answer the question and answer all of the parts of the question, right? And so characteristics and qualities that are necessary for being a physician, you have here, I think all leaders must not command, but instead inspire and empower the team to achieve its mission. So I don't know if that's a characteristic or quality. It's more of a leadership style.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm like, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Like, let's say that's a characteristics that you must inspire. Okay? And then you go on here. This means more than just listening to what others have to say, but working together and compromising to provide the best work possible. Okay, great. Are those more characteristics? Teamwork, compromising? Sure, we'll call those. And then you say physicians should work on becoming team-focused leaders, which demonstrate trust and collaboration by role modeling. So, are you saying all physicians should work on becoming? Right? It's such a nitpicky, nuanced thing, but it's like, well, did you really answer the question of, do you think all physicians? Right? Being as literal as, I think all physicians should work on, like, then you're answering the question. I know you're answering the question. So super nitpicky thing there. And then you jump right into a story. I actually, for as much as I talk about stories, I don't think stories work very well in secondaries because they're a distraction from answering the question. So you jump into the story as an assistant manager at a local bakery. So now you're talking about a time where you were a leader. Yeah. Right? An assistant manager. You tried very hard to call that out right at the beginning. Like, oh, this is a leadership position. Did the prompt ask for an example of when you were a leader?
I guess not, no.
No.
Yeah. I got that from, there was another essay that asked me, describe a time that you were a leader and describe your leadership style. So
yeah. And that would have been a very different answer, right? Then I couldn't say it didn't ask for an example because it did. So you have to, this is where it gets tricky, copying and pasting from one secondary to another. You have to remove parts, I think, that don't necessarily belong because it didn't ask. Okay. And then you get to, in a healthcare setting, and this is very common, students need to translate everything into healthcare. It doesn't ask for that, right? Okay. We must similarly make use of specialized team members. Okay. The next one here as well. During the pandemic, we frequently encounter information gaps. Discuss one such gap and how you went about gathering and using the information you found. How has that affected your outlook on the role of medicine? You didn't answer this question at all. This looks like you copied and pasted what has COVID taught you about whatever? Because you talked all about misinformation and disinformation, not information gaps, right? Okay. And so very buzzwordy, kind of like everyone's talking about misinformation, disinformation, but the follow-up of how has this affected your outlook on the role of medicine, you didn't answer that at all. Right, so I would read these going, like, you're not answering the questions, you're avoiding me, I don't want to bother anymore, okay? For secondaries, it's very, very, very important to answer those questions directly. So, clinical experience, shadowing, always important, that never goes away. For the most part, your primary was okay, other than that personal statement because of the lack of clinical experience and shadowing and potentially avoiding talking about your dad. So no huge red flags in your primary, just again, some disconnects and a lack of understanding who you are, why you're here, and then just some frustrations around the secondary with not answering the question.
Even like a lot of the Canadian applications, there wasn't really an option for medical experience. There wasn't like,
yeah,
most of them didn't even have personal statements per se.
Yeah.
Or even essays about why I want to be a doctor. So I think it's not something I super prepared for.
Yeah.
In just my work and life. And then I don't know if I have the time to, get a job at like in a clinical role. Like I'm working at a research lab this summer, and then I'll be either doing masters or hopefully med school. But
why the focus on research when I'm telling you that clinical is more important?
Well, I think this just leads me to like my backup plan.
and
I don't want
that's
to.
The problem.
I don't get it in, right?
Yeah, no, and that's exactly the problem. Is your preparation for a backup plan is making your backup plan your primary plan.
Right.
You're avoiding chasing plan A because you're too worried about plan B. And that right there is why I tell students not to have a plan B.
Okay.
It's a distraction. If your goal's to go to medical school, then figure out a way to get into medical school, not have a backup plan.
I don't know, just like when I think about, what do I want to do next year when I graduate?
Yeah.
Working as, an at-home care assistant or something like that I can just apply to and get in. That is, medically related. It just doesn't appeal to me as much as doing a master's. And
why are you going to do a master's? Your GPA is a 3.8.
Yeah.
You don't need to prove academic ability anymore.
I think that would make sense if I was a United States application only. But I just feel like in Canada, the grades are much more competitive. Now, my grades this year are better as well, so I might not even need to. Also, I think to be honest, I'd like to do a master's. I think it's interesting out of itself. I
always say, I'll tell you what I think, but at the end of the day, you do what you feel comfortable with, and I hope it all works out for you.